"He's already married," the detective said. 30 seconds before the toast. I stood at the back of the tent. The man who'd spent 11 years teaching my daughter how to fall without breaking, how to read a room before she ever stepped into it. I'd hired someone to watch her fiancé the night he asked what I planned to leave her when I was gone. Now I just had to decide how much of it she'd hear tonight. I taught my daughter to fall without breaking when she was 12 years old. 16 years of backyard drills, weekend mornings before the dew burned off. Her small hands learning to redirect force the way I learned it at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe. She hated it at 14, loved it at 20, forgot about it at 30. And on a Saturday evening in December, under rented string lights at a garden venue in Southlake, Texas. 30 seconds before a man she loved struck her across the face in front of 30 guests. I learned he had another wife in Georgia. I was standing near the tent wall with a glass of sparkling water I hadn't touched when Eugene Langley appeared at my elbow. Eugene was 63, a retired forensic accountant who had spent his years with the Marshal service following money instead of fugitives. He was the kind of man who showed up at your side only when the math had finished running and the answer was bad. "He's already married," Eugene said, barely above a whisper. Georgia, certified record in my car. Across the garden, my daughter Celestine stood beside Jules Ross, her hand on his arm, laughing at something a guest had said. She was 30, an investment analyst in Dallas who had inherited her mother's composure and her mother's stubbornness in equal measure. Jules was 33, a boutique real estate developer from Austin with an open collar and the particular warmth of a man who had decided long ago that charm was something you performed rather than something you felt. He was raising a champagne flute. The fire pit near the entrance threw cedar smoke across the cold grass, and the string lights swayed in a wind that smelled like December. The MC stepped to the microphone. "If everyone could raise their glasses for the happy couple." I looked at my daughter's face and made the decision before my next heartbeat. What happened next came in pieces. Not because memory failed, but because some moments arrive faster than language. Jules's hand connecting with Celestine's cheek. The sound, wet and flat, cutting through 30 conversations like a knife through paper. Then her pivot. Weight low, hands redirecting. Exactly the way I had drilled her in the backyard since she was 12. His own momentum carried him sideways. The crack of his collarbone hitting the edge of a solid oak table was audible from the back row of chairs. He did not get up. Celestine stood over him in a white dress, hands trembling, the red mark on her cheek already swelling. She was breathing through her nose, grounded, steady, standing exactly the way I taught her to stand. I took one step forward. I looked at the room. 30 faces, none of them moving, none of them breathing. I said it to no one in particular and to everyone at once. "That's my daughter." Somewhere behind me, a voice, "Someone call 911. But I need to go back. Because what happened at that party did not start at that party. It started 6 weeks earlier, in a quieter room, with a question I almost missed. My name is Otis Barker. I am 61 years old, and I have spent the last 11 years trying very hard to be ordinary. I live on a quiet street in Fort Worth, in the house my wife and I bought when Celestine was 9. The neighbors know me as the man who mows on Thursdays and waves from the driveway without stopping to talk. They know I manage a family trust. They know my daughter works in Dallas and visits on weekends when she can. They know my wife passed 7 years ago, and that I keep the rose bushes she planted trimmed to the same height she liked. What they do not know is everything else. 30 years with the United States Marshal Service, fugitive recovery, witness protection details. The kind of work where you learn to read a room the way a surgeon reads a scan, looking for the thing that does not belong. I retired at 50 because I had promised my wife I would, and because the work had started following me home in ways I could feel but could not name. I put the badge in a drawer. I learned to cook. I joined a gym that did not require me to qualify on a firing range. I became, by every visible measure, a man with nothing left to prove. But old training does not retire. It waits. It sits in the back of your mind like a smoke detector with a fresh battery, silent until something starts burning. And on a Thursday evening in late October, at a steakhouse in Sundance Square, something burning. Jules Ross had ordered a bottle of wine before we arrived. He had reserved a corner booth. He had complimented my jacket, asked about the Cowboys, laughed at exactly the right moments. And then, somewhere between the second glass and the appetizer, he leaned across the white tablecloth and asked a question about the Barker family trust that no man asks his future father-in-law unless he has already calculated the answer. The temperature in the room dropped by half a degree. Nobody felt it but me. He asked about estate optimization. Those were the words he used, sitting across from me in a dark wood booth at the steakhouse in Sundance Square, candlelight catching the wine he had ordered before Celestine and I arrived. He framed it inside a story about a client whose family trust had been poorly structured. A cautionary tale delivered between the main course and dessert with the ease of a man making conversation. But I had spent 30 years listening to people frame questions inside stories, and the question underneath was not casual. In my line of work, I've seen families blindsided by trusts they never restructured, Jules said, turning his glass by the stem. What does your long-term plan look like for Celestine's financial future? Celestine's hand moved to her wineglass, not to drink, to hold something. I said, Celestine's always figured things out on her own. He was good. I want to be honest about that, because the easier version of this story is the one where I say I saw through him immediately. I did not. What I saw was a man who had done his homework. He knew the restaurant. He knew the wine list. He had arrived 15 minutes early and chosen a corner booth where the ambient noise covered low conversation but did not force raised voices. He had asked me 2 questions about Celestine in the first 6 minutes, both thoughtful, both specific. He had complimented my jacket without overdoing it and asked about the Cowboys with enough knowledge to prove he had watched at least one game. The third question was the one that mattered. And he buried it so deep inside a pivot about a client whose estate planning had transformed his daughter's life that most men would have answered it without noticing that they were being interviewed. I noticed. Not because the question was wrong, because it was too right. The phrasing was precise, the timing was surgical. And underneath the warmth, underneath the anecdote and the easy smile, there was a structure to the way Jules Ross gathered information that I recognized because I had been trained in the same discipline, just on the other side of the table. Celestine laughed at something he said next, and her laugh was real. And I understood in that moment that whatever I was feeling could not be spoken aloud without evidence. A father who dislikes his daughter's fiancé is a cliché. A father who dislikes him for the right reasons needs proof. Dessert arrived. I did not touch mine. Jules ordered espresso. Celestine excused herself to the restroom, and in the 40 seconds she was gone, Jules leaned back and said, "She's remarkable, you know. You did something right." I smiled, he smiled. 2 men smiling at each other across a white tablecloth, one of them meaning it. The drive home took 22 minutes, leather seats cold against my back, hands at 10 and 2, the city thinning out into the residential dark of my neighborhood. My mind was working through what had just happened, the way it used to work through things when working through things quickly was something I got paid to do. I was not building a case. I was sorting a feeling into categories. Category 1, protective father, reading too much into a dinner conversation. Category 2, trained operative, reading exactly the right amount. I needed someone who could tell me which category I was in. I pulled into the driveway at 9:47. I know the time because I checked the microwave clock when I walked through the kitchen. the way I have checked every clock in every room I enter since 1989. Old habits do not retire, they just stop drawing a salary. My study is a small room off the hallway, one window, one desk, one lamp. I sat down and scrolled through my phone to a name I had not called in 14 months. Eugene Langley. We had worked together in circumstances that do not need detailing here, except to say that when I needed someone to follow money quietly and without error, Eugene was the only call I made. He answered on the second ring. "It's late for you," he said. "I need you to look into someone," I told him. "A man named Jules Ross, developer out of Austin. He's engaged to Celestine." Eugene did not respond immediately. He was the kind of man who let information settle before he answered it, the way a stone settles in water, displacing only what it needs to. "What kind of looking into?" he asked. "The kind where you tell me if I'm being overprotective," I said, "or the kind where you tell me I'm not." A pause. I could hear him breathing, which meant he was already thinking. "How much time do I have before the engagement party?" I said. "I don't want to know after." Eugene exhaled through his nose. It was the sound he made when he was already running through what the job would require, what databases to pull, which county clerks owed him favors. How many phone calls stood between this moment and an answer? "Before the party," he repeated. A pause that lasted long enough to carry weight. "I'll see what I find." He hung up. I sat in my study, with the desk lamp as the only light in the house, and thought about a man who asks a question about money over steak and candlelight. And the particular kind of preparation that question requires before it ever leaves your mouth. 2 weeks passed. Eugene was working. I was waiting. And on a Saturday morning in mid-November, I stood at my kitchen counter with both hands around a coffee mug, watching my daughter through the window as she pruned the rose bushes her mother had planted along the back fence. The sun was warm for November. Celestine had her sleeves rolled up, her hair pulled back, her gardening gloves dark with soil. It was the kind of scene that should have made me feel something simple. Instead, I was rehearsing how to lie to her face. She came inside 10 minutes later, set the gloves on the counter, and looked at me the way she had been looking at me for 2 weeks. Like she was waiting for me to say something I was not going to say. "You don't like him, do you?" No preamble, no warm-up. That was Celestine. She had inherited her mother's composure, but not her patience for circling a subject. I said I barely knew the man. She pulled a thorn from her thumb. A bead of blood appeared, and she did not flinch. She never flinched. That was the problem. My daughter walked straight into thorns and called it gardening. "You were quiet at dinner," she said. "You watched him the whole night. You left before dessert and told me you were tired, but your light was on until midnight." I drove past. She had driven past. She had checked my window. I had underestimated how closely she was reading me, and that miscalculation landed in my chest like a cold stone. "I'm your father," I said. "I'm allowed to be cautious." Cautious is asking about his job. Cautious is Googling his name. What you're doing is something else. She folded her arms. "Sometimes you look at everyone like a suspect. Dad, you've been retired 6 years. The line hit because it was true. I had been looking at Jules like a suspect. I had been running his words through a filter I had built over 3 decades of reading people who did not want to be read. And my daughter, who analyzed numbers for a living, had turned that same skill on me and found the discrepancy. I set down my coffee. I looked at her. I said the only thing I could say that was honest without being complete. "I don't need to like him, sweetheart. I just need to know who he is." Celestine stared at me. For a moment I thought she would push further, demand specifics, ask the questions I could not yet answer. But something shifted behind her eyes. She read my words as grief, as a father struggling to let go of his daughter after losing his wife. She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around me, and I held her, and over her shoulder my face told the truth she could not see. This was not grief. This was field work. She stayed for lunch. We talked about her work, about the engagement party venue she had booked in Southlake, about the caterer who kept changing the per-plate price. I asked questions and laughed in the right places and felt the specific weight of a man performing normalcy while his mind runs on a separate track. When she left at 3, she kissed my cheek and said she loved me. I said it back. I meant it more than she knew. At 7 that evening, I heard an engine in the driveway. A Lincoln. I recognized the idol before the doorbell rang. Percy Bailey had been the Barker family's estate planning attorney for 19 years. A silver-haired man of 67 who moved through paperwork the way a surgeon moved through tissue, precise and unhurried. He never dropped by unannounced. The fact that he was standing on my porch with his coat buttoned and his briefcase at his side meant something had changed. I let him in. He declined coffee. That meant it would be short. "I've been updating the trust documents for the annual review," Percy said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Routine cross-reference on beneficiary-adjacent parties. Your future son-in-law's development LLC has been dissolved and reformed twice in 3 years. Each time in a different state, each time with a different co-signer." He paused. "Could be nothing. Developers restructure all the time." "But," I said, "but the most recent co-signer is a woman in Nevada whose name I cannot verify through any standard registry. No professional license, no tax filing, no property record. She either does not exist or does not exist under that name." I told him I already had someone looking into it. I told him I needed him to hold, to not make inquiries that could reach Jules or anyone connected to Jules. Percy's jaw tightened. He mentioned his fiduciary duty to the trust. I understood. I asked for 2 weeks. "Give me 2 weeks," I said. "If there's nothing, we move on. If there's something, I'll bring it to you first." Percy stood, buttoned his coat, looked at me the way attorneys look at clients who think they have more control than they do. "I hope you're right that you've got this handled," he said, "because if that trust is exposed, it's not just your money, it's Celestine's future." He left. I watched his taillights turn the corner, then my phone buzzed, a text from Eugene, 2 lines on the screen. "Call me when you're alone. Found something in Clark County." Clark County is Las Vegas. I looked back toward the hallway, toward the guest room where Celestine sometimes stayed. The door was closed. The house was quiet. I stepped outside into the cold and dialed. I dialed Eugene's number standing on my front porch in the dark. The call connected before the first ring finished. He had been calling me at the same moment. "You saw my text," he said. "Clark County," I said. "Tell me." "Not on the phone. Come to my office in the morning, 8 sharp." I did not sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen with the lights off and the coffee cold and thought about Nevada. Percy had found a co-signer there who did not exist in any registry. Now, Eugene had found something in Clark County, which is Las Vegas, which is the kind of place where people go to do things they do not want attached to their real lives. 2 threads from 2 different sources pointing at the same state. That is not coincidence. That is geography confirming what instinct already suspects. What I did not know, as I sat in that dark kitchen, was that 30 miles east in her Dallas apartment, my daughter was awake too. Celestine was at her laptop, reviewing a set of property documents Jules had forwarded earlier that week. She had been skimming them routinely, the way she skimmed any financial paperwork. When something caught her eye, one of the PDFs carried a watermark beneath the logo of Jules's development firm. A second company name, faint, partially visible beneath the branding layer. A firm she did not recognize. The watermark looked like a bruise under makeup, something meant to stay hidden that the light caught wrong. She almost closed the file, almost told herself it was a formatting error, a template bleed from a partner firm, but Celestine was an analyst. She did not close files when the numbers looked wrong. She screenshotted the page, saved it to a folder on her desktop, and sat for a long time looking at the engagement ring on her left hand. Then she picked up her phone and texted me. "Hey, Dad, can we talk tomorrow? Not urgent, just something weird." I did not see that text until after Eugene's call. If I had, I might have moved faster. I was at Eugene's office at 7:53. He had coffee waiting and a single sheet of paper face down on his desk. His office was on the 4th floor of a converted warehouse near the design district. The kind of space that looked like an architect's studio, but functioned like a war room. Filing cabinets along every wall, 2 monitors, a whiteboard he had already wiped clean, which meant whatever had been on it was now in his head. "2 things," Eugene said. He did not sit down. First, Jules Ross did not personally inquire about the structure of the Barker family trust. He hired a third-party attorney to request a structural summary from the county filing office. The request was made under a generic due diligence provision. Legal. Routine-looking. But he used a cutout. I let that settle. He didn't ask about the trust himself. Eugene continued. He hired someone to ask for him. That's not curiosity. That's reconnaissance. Eugene slid the sheet of paper across the desk. No staple, no folder. Just a name, a date, and a county seal. Clark County, Nevada. A filing that linked the name Jules Ross to a document classified under domestic records. Eugene had not been able to access the full filing yet. It could be a business license, it could be a name change, or it could be what the classification code suggested it was. Could be a marriage filing, Eugene said quietly. I looked at the paper. I read the date. It was from 3 years ago. Could be, I repeated. Could be is not good enough, Eugene said. I need 72 hours to get the actual document. Clark County is slow. I've got a contact in the records office, but she works Tuesday through Thursday, and she owes me exactly 1 favor. I was gripping the armrest of my chair the way I used to grip my service weapon at the range. Index finger straight along the frame, thumb locked, knuckles white. I made myself let go. 72 hours, I said. Eugene nodded. Then he sat down for the first time since I had arrived and leaned forward with his elbows on the desk. I need to say something to you as your friend, not as your investigator, he said. If this filing is what I think it is, if Jules Ross is currently married to someone else while engaged to your daughter, then this is not a family matter anymore. This is criminal. Bigamy is a felony in Texas. And if he used interstate communications to facilitate a fraudulent marriage for financial gain, that is federal territory. He paused. If this marriage is real, Eugene said, it's not just family business anymore. I drove home with the window cracked and cold air filling the car. My hands were steady on the wheel, my mind was not. I was thinking about the trust inquiry, the Nevada cosigner Percy had found, the Clark County filing, and the way all 3 lines converged on a single point that I could feel but not yet prove. At a red light on University Drive, I checked my phone for the first time since leaving the office. There was Celestine's text from the night before. I had missed it entirely. I called her. She answered on the first ring. Dad, I found something too. The line went quiet. Neither of us knew who should speak first. We did compare notes that night on the phone. I told her about the third-party attorney who had probed the trust. She told me about the watermark. We agreed it could mean nothing. We agreed to keep watching. And then, 3 days later, Celestine called me again, and her voice had changed completely. She was bright, animated, talking about centerpieces and table linens and whether the caterer could do a gluten-free option for Jules's college friend from Houston. She told me Jules had been working on his toast for the party and that he wanted me at the head table. He said it wouldn't feel right without you, Dad. Dad. I closed my eyes. Tell him I wouldn't miss it. She had chosen to forget. That was what I understood as I stood in my kitchen, listening to my daughter describe seating arrangements with the enthusiasm of a woman building something beautiful. The watermark, the vague unease, the late-night text that said something weird had become, in 72 hours. Something she had folded up and placed in a drawer marked, "Not now." Not because she was stupid, because she was in love. And love, when it is new and good and full of plans, has a specific gravity that pulls doubt underground. Listening to her describe the party felt like watching someone arrange flowers on a trapdoor. She talked for 20 minutes. I asked about the dress. I asked about the music. I congratulated her on the venue in Southlake, which I had already driven past twice to memorize the parking layout and the exits. She did not need to know that. She needed a father who was happy for her, and I gave her one. I performed the role with a precision that came from the same training that had once allowed me to sit across from violent men and make them believe I was their friend. When she hung up, I sat motionless on the kitchen stool with the phone in my hand. I counted the minutes. 11. I sat there for 11 minutes without moving, without thinking a complete thought. Just feeling the weight of what I was carrying and measuring it against what it would cost to set it down in front of her. The cost was too high. Not yet. Not without proof. On Tuesday, I drove to Eugene's office, 4 days before the party. He was standing at the whiteboard when I came in. And this time, it was not wiped clean. There were names on it, dates, a map of county jurisdictions in Georgia drawn in blue marker, with one county circled twice. Fulton County. "Sit down," Eugene said. I sat. The Clark County filing was a dead end, business license, not a marriage, but it led me somewhere else. He opened a manila folder and turned it so the name faced me. Fulton County, Georgia. Isolde Norris. Marriage certificate filed 4 years ago. Groom's name, Jules Avery Ross. The name hit me like a fist I had been bracing for. Isolde Norris. A real woman, a real marriage, filed in a real courthouse in a real county in Georgia. Dissolution filing, I asked. None. I checked Fulton and every adjacent county. DeKalb, Gwinnett, Clayton, Cobb, Douglas. No divorce petition, no annulment, no legal separation. As far as the state of Georgia is concerned, Jules Ross is a married man. Eugene sat down across from me. His voice dropped half a register. I don't have the certified copy yet. Fulton County's records office is backed up. My contact there works 3 days a week, and I've already used the one favor she owed me, just to confirm the filing exists. Getting the stamped document could take until Friday. Could take longer. The party is Saturday, I said. Eugene nodded slowly. Can you have it by then? A pause. Eugene looked at the whiteboard, at the circled county, at the name written in his careful block letters. Then he looked at me. I'll try. 2 words. Ordinary words. The kind of words people say every day without thinking about what they carry. But in that office, on that Tuesday afternoon, they carried everything. They carried my daughter's future, and a dead woman's rose bushes, and a trust my wife had insisted we protect, and a man named Jules Ross, who was building a life on a marriage that already existed. I thought about the head table, Jules on one side, me on the other, Celestine between us, smiling at a man who might already belong to someone else. Raising a glass to a future that might be built on a felony. I stood up. I buttoned my jacket. If the documents don't come, I said, do I let my daughter walk into that party? Eugene did not answer. He looked at me the way he had looked at me for 30 years, which was the way a man looks at another man when the question being asked does not have an answer that fits inside a sentence. The clock on his office wall read 4:47, Tuesday afternoon. The party was Saturday evening. Between now and then, a woman in a county records office in Atlanta held the only piece of paper that could prove what I already knew in my bones. I walked out of the building and into the Dallas cold and started counting hours. Wednesday came and went. Thursday, Friday morning, no call from Eugene. The Fulton County Records Office operated on its own clock, and that clock did not care about a garden party in Southlake. By Friday evening, I had accepted the possibility that Saturday would arrive without proof, and I would have to stand in a rented tent and raise a glass to a man I believed was already married. Then Jules invited me to dinner. He chose the same steakhouse in Sundance Square, same corner booth. He had arrived early again, and this time he had ordered a bottle of Bordeaux before Celestine and I walked through the door. He stood when we approached, kissed Celestine on the temple, shook my hand with that calibrated grip, and raised the bottle toward the candlelight. "To family becoming official," he said. I smiled. I touched my glass to his. The wine tasted like copper and oak, and I did not want it. The first hour was performance. Jules asked about my week. I asked about his latest project in Austin. Celestine talked about a new client at work, something involving municipal bond restructuring that made Jules lean in with exaggerated interest. He laughed when she made a joke about spreadsheets. He remembered the name of a colleague she had mentioned weeks ago. He was thorough. He was warm. He was doing what he always did, which was make every person at the table feel like the most important person in the room. Jules said the word consolidate the way a man says love, practiced, smooth, entirely for the audience. It happened between the main course and dessert, the same window he had used at the first dinner. He leaned back, loosened his collar, and said it casually. "The way you mentioned something you have been thinking about but have not yet committed to. Once we're family, it makes sense to consolidate. Your trust, my holdings, one structure, better returns, and Celestine's protected either way." I set down my fork. Celestine turned to me. Not with surprise, with preparation. She had rehearsed this moment. She knew it was coming because Jules had already told her it was coming. "Jules has been looking into it, Dad," she said. "It actually sounds smart." That was the detail that changed everything. Not the proposal itself, which I had half expected since the first dinner. The detail was that he had already coached her. He had taken the conversation to Celestine privately, framed it as financial wisdom, let her absorb it, and then brought her to this table as his advocate. He was not pitching me. He was presenting a decision that had already been made in a room I was not in. I looked at Jules. He held my gaze the way confident men hold gazes, with just enough openness to suggest he had nothing to hide. But I had been reading faces since before this man was born, and what I saw behind the openness was patience. The patience of a man who knows the answer before he asks the question. I picked up my napkin. I folded it once, placed it on the table, and put my hand in my lap. My fist closed under the tablecloth. "We'll discuss that later," I said. "Tonight's about celebrating." Celestine reached across the table and squeezed my hand. The same hand that had been white-knuckled around linen 2 seconds earlier. I opened my fingers and squeezed back and felt the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from holding two truths at once, that I loved my daughter without reservation, and that the man sitting across from me had been inside my family's financial architecture before I ever knew his name. Dessert arrived. Jules ordered espresso again. Celestine excused herself to the restroom again, and in the silence between her leaving and her returning. Jules looked at me with an expression I had not seen from him before, not warm, not charming, evaluating. The look lasted less than 2 seconds, and then the warmth returned like a light switching on. I filed it. We left at 9. The parking lot was cold and half empty. Jules walked Celestine to her car with his hand on the small of her back, opened her door, waited for her to settle. Then he turned back to me and extended his hand. "Great evening," he said. "And listen, about the trust consolidation, I've already had a trust attorney run some preliminary numbers, nothing formal. Just wanted to see what the structure looks like before I brought it to you. Hope that's all right." He said it the way you say you check the weather before a road trip. Casual, already done, not asking permission. A trust attorney. The same words Eugene had used when he described the third-party probe. Jules had just confirmed it himself, standing in a parking lot, shaking my hand, smiling. He had hired someone to examine my family's trust before he ever proposed this merger to my face, and now he was telling me about it like it was a courtesy. I shook his hand. I held the grip for exactly the right duration. I watched him open Celestine's car door like a gentleman and walk to his own vehicle with the easy stride of a man who believed he was winning. Walking to my truck felt like leaving an interrogation room, except I had been the one under the lights, and the suspect had been buying the wine. I sat behind the wheel. I did not start the engine. I watched their taillights disappear down the block and thought one thing clearly. This man has been inside my family's finances before I ever shook his hand. And the party is tomorrow. I started the engine and sat in the parking lot for a full minute before pulling out. I was running timelines. The party was tomorrow evening. Eugene had not called. Jules had just confirmed with his own mouth that he had hired someone to examine my family's trust. And my daughter was walking toward her car 30 yards away with her fiancé's hand on her shoulder. Then Celestine stopped. She said something to Jules. He kissed her forehead, got in his car, and drove away. She waited until his taillights turned the corner. Then she walked back to my truck and stood at the driver's window. "How long are you going to pretend nothing's wrong?" Her voice was not angry. It was tired. The tiredness of a woman who had been watching her father perform normalcy for weeks and had run out of patience for the show. "You're doing that face again," she said, "the one where you're deciding whether to tell me something." "I'm tired, baby girl. It was a long dinner." "You used to say that right before you'd leave for 3 days on a case." She had been cataloging me. That was what I understood, standing there with the window down and the December cold coming in. My daughter had spent years watching my face the way I had spent years watching other people's faces, and she had built her own file. She knew my tells. She knew the difference between tired and operational, and she was telling me, in the parking lot of a steakhouse, that I was not fooling her. I wanted to tell her everything right there under the parking lot lights, every thread, every suspicion, the name in Fulton County, the trust probe, all of it. But telling her meant losing control of the timeline, and the timeline was all I left. If I told her now, before Eugene had the certified proof, she would confront Jules. Jules would deny it. It would become her word against his, my suspicion against his charm. And without documentation, it would look exactly like what Jules would say it was an overprotective father who could not let go. So I lied again. "I'm adjusting," I said, "to the idea of sharing you, that's all." She looked at me for a long time. Then she nodded once, slowly, the way you nod when you accept an answer you do not believe because the alternative is a conversation you are not ready to have. She touched my arm through the window, said good night, and walked to her car. I drove home and did not sleep. The next morning, Celestine called Jules. She told me about it later, after everything. She said she had been sitting at her kitchen table in her Dallas apartment, drinking coffee, thinking about the dinner and about my face and about a detail she had let go of weeks ago but that had come back in the night, the way unresolved things do. The document, the watermark she had found beneath his company logo, the firm name she did not recognize. She called in casually, asked about breakfast plans, asked about the party timeline. Then she mentioned the document. "That file you forwarded last month had a different letterhead underneath yours," she said. "What was that?" Jules did not miss a beat. "Oh, that. Mercer and Holt. The partner firm we used for about 6 months. Their templates bled through on some of our shared files. I should have caught it before forwarding. Smooth. Specific. A name, a time frame, an explanation that sounded like mild embarrassment over a formatting error. How does a man lie that smoothly about a letterhead and not blink? unless he has rehearsed for questions she has not even thought to ask yet. Celestine said she believed him. She said the answer made sense. She said she hung up the phone and felt fine. But she did not feel fine. Something in the way he answered was too clean, too ready. Not the stumbling recall of a man trying to remember a minor detail, but the polished delivery of a man who had prepared for exactly this question. She recognized the difference because she spent her professional life reading financial statements. And the ones that were too clean were always the ones that needed a second look. She walked to her bedroom. The engagement dress hung on the closet door, white and expensive, the one she had shown me photos of 3 times. She stood in front of it for a while. She told me later that she tried to feel what she was supposed to feel looking at it: excitement, anticipation, joy. Instead, she felt the specific gravity of a question she had not yet asked, pulling her toward something she did not want to find. The dress hung on the closet door like a question mark, white, expensive, waiting for an answer she was no longer sure she wanted. She sat down at her laptop. She opened a browser. She typed Mercer and Holt Attorney Firm into the search bar and pressed enter. 0 results. She tried Mercer Holt Law Firm. Nothing. Mercer and Holt Legal. Nothing. Mercer Holt Attorneys Texas. Nothing. She closed the laptop slowly. She looked at the dress one more time. Then she picked up her phone, not to call Jules, to call me. My phone rang at 11:14 on a Friday morning, the day before the party. I saw her name on the screen and answered before the second ring. Celestine's call was short. She told me Jules had named a firm that did not exist. She told me she had searched every variation. She told me she was not sure what it meant, but she was sure it meant something. I listened. I did not tell her what I knew. I told her we would talk after the party, and that I loved her, and that whatever happened, she should trust what she saw with her own eyes. She said okay. She did not sound okay. I hung up and spread the venue floor plan across my kitchen table. The South Lake Garden venue had sent it as part of the rental packet. I picked up a red pen and marked 3 exits: the main gate, the service entrance behind the catering tent, and a side path that ran along the fence line toward the overflow parking. I had not drawn an extraction route in 6 years, but my hand remembered. 3 exits, 2 fallback points, 1 person to protect. I called Eugene. "The party is tomorrow evening," I said. "Where are we?" "Fulton County has not released the certified copy. My contact says it could come through tonight. Could come through tomorrow morning. Could come through Monday." "Monday is too late." "I know." I told him the plan. He would position himself at a coffee shop on South Lake Boulevard, 2 miles from the venue. If the documents arrived and I called, he would drive straight there. If I did not call, he would wait. 2 miles from the venue, I said. If I call, you drive. If I don't call, you wait. And if the documents don't come at all, I looked at the floor plan on my table, at the red marks I had made. At the exits I had labeled with the same shorthand I used to label exits in federal courthouses and safe houses and the kinds of buildings where people sometimes left through windows instead of doors. "Then I go in with what I have," I said, "and pray I'm wrong." Eugene was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would be at the coffee shop by noon. That night I did not sleep. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle and thought about the morning, about Celestine in her dress, about Jules in his suit, about 30 guests raising glasses to a future that might not be real. I thought about Percy, whose 2-week deadline had now expired, who had not called, who was either waiting for me or preparing to act on his own. I thought about the name in Georgia that I could not yet prove on paper. I got up at 5. I showered. I put on the suit I had laid out and drove to South Lake in the dark. The venue was beautiful in the early morning. December light coming through the garden lattice, white chairs arranged in rows on the lawn. a tent with sides that could be raised or lowered depending on the wind. The florists arrived at 7, the caterers at 7:30. I helped unload boxes from a van and carried centerpieces to tables and moved like a man with purpose, because purpose is what keeps your hands from shaking. Celestine arrived at 8. She was radiant. Hair done, makeup perfect, wearing jeans and a flannel over her dress because she intended to supervise every detail before changing. She saw me and her face opened up. "Dad, you came early. Jules said would. Wouldn't let you hang those lights alone," I said. "Your mother would have had my head." She laughed. The laugh was real. Whatever doubt had surfaced about the non-existent firm had been folded back down, pressed flat by the weight of this day and everything she wanted it to be. She was choosing to believe, not because she was foolish, but because the alternative was too large to hold on the morning of your own engagement party. Celestine laughed at something a florist said about gardenias, and the sound hit me like a verdict. This is what I was about to take from her this morning. This lightness, this version of her life where the man she loved was who he said he was. If Eugene's documents arrived, I would take all of it. And if they did not arrive, I would spend the evening watching her smile at a man who might already belong to someone else and say nothing. I hung the last row of string lights. I tested the sound system. I arranged the head table the way Celestine wanted it, with my chair on one end and a place card for Jules on the other. I set down his name card and looked at it and felt nothing that could fit inside a single word. My phone buzzed at 10:47. Short. Flat. The kind of vibration that does not care what you are holding or who you are smiling at. Eugene. 2 words on the screen. On my way. Have progress. Progress. Not proof. Not confirmation. Progress. I read the text twice. I looked up. Across the garden, Celestine was adjusting a centerpiece, humming something I did not recognize. Behind her, through the venue gate, a car pulled into the parking lot. Not Eugene's sedan, a black SUV. Jules stepped out 4 hours early, garment bag over his shoulder, sunglasses on, smiling the way he always smiled, like the world was a room he had already measured. I stood in the garden between my daughter and her fiancé, with a buzzing phone in my pocket and no proof in my hand. I pocketed my phone and watched Jules cross the garden toward Celestine with his garment bag and his easy stride. I smiled. He smiled. We shook hands for the second time in 12 hours. And I helped him carry a box of champagne flutes to the catering table, while my phone sat heavy against my thigh like a grenade with no pin. By 2 o'clock, 30 guests had arrived. Jules had every one of them laughing before the first champagne flute was empty, and I counted every handshake the way a man counts exits in a burning building. He moved through the crowd with a precision I recognized. Not the wandering warmth of a man enjoying a party, but the targeted navigation of someone working a room for a purpose. He spent 4 minutes with a woman named Gloria Whitfield, who sat on the advisory board for 2 family trusts in Tarrant County. He spent 6 minutes with her husband, a retired banking executive. He used estate planning terminology the way native speakers use idioms, naturally and without effort. And every time he said the word legacy, he glanced in my direction. A woman I did not recognize touched Jules's arm and called him a visionary. Jules thanked her and looked directly at me while he did it. The look lasted 1 second. It was not hostile. It was inventory. He was checking to see if I was watching. I was. Percy Bailey appeared at my shoulder. He had a glass of sparkling water and the expression of a man attending a funeral disguised as a celebration. "He's networking your trust contacts," Percy said, low enough that only I could hear. "You see that, right?" "I see everything," I said. "That's the problem." Percy looked at me. He wanted to ask what I knew. He wanted to ask whether his 2-week window had produced anything. But Percy was a man who understood silences. and my silence told him that the situation had not resolved, and that asking further questions in a tent full of witnesses was not the place. He nodded once and drifted back into the crowd. I stayed at the wall. I checked my phone every 90 seconds, nothing from Eugene. The caterers brought out appetizers. A jazz trio started playing near the garden entrance. Celestine moved through the party like light through glass, greeting everyone, laughing, touching Jules's arm the way you touch something you believe belongs to you. She was beautiful, she was happy, and I was the only person in that garden who knew that her happiness might be built on a document filed in a courthouse 1,000 miles away. At 4:17, my phone vibrated. Eugene, one line, parking lot, now. I set my champagne glass on the nearest table and walked toward the gate without looking back. The gravel crunched under my shoes. The afternoon had turned cold, and the parking lot was half in shadow. Eugene's sedan was parked in the far corner, engine off, window down. He held up his phone. The screen glowed in the gray light like a surgeon studying results while the patient was already on the table. Fulton County confirmed by phone 40 minutes ago, Eugene said. The marriage was never dissolved, no divorce, no annulment, no separation filing in any adjacent jurisdiction. He is legally married. I exhaled. But, Eugene said, there is always a but. The certified digital record is still transmitting. Fulton County's system queues documents for electronic stamp in the order they're requested, and there are 11 ahead of mine. Without the stamp, this is a phone confirmation. It's enough for you and me. It is not enough for a courtroom, and it is not enough for a woman who is going to ask me how I know. I looked back toward the venue. Through the tent's open side, I could see Celestine adjusting Jules's boutonniere. Her fingers were gentle, trusting, touching the lapel of a man who was already someone else's husband. She smoothed the fabric, and he kissed her forehead, and 30 people watched and smiled. The toast is in 20 minutes, I said. Eugene looked at his phone, refreshed the screen. Nothing. I need a few more minutes, he said. Maybe 10, maybe more. I don't have more. I know. We stood there in the parking lot cold, two men who had spent their careers waiting for evidence to arrive before deadlines that did not care about evidence. Inside the tent, the MC stepped to the microphone. I heard the tap. I heard the feedback squeal. I heard the words through the canvas. If everyone could find their seats, we're going to get started with a very special toast. I heard Celestine's name through the speakers. I heard applause. I looked at Eugene. He was staring at his phone, thumb hovering over the refresh button, jaw tight. Go, he said. I'll come find you the second lands. I turned and walked back toward the lights. The gravel shifted under my feet. The jazz trio was playing something slow. The string lights I had hung that morning swayed in the wind. I stepped through the gate and into the garden and took my seat at the head table, one chair away from the man my daughter loved. With no proof in my hand and a phone in my pocket that had not yet buzzed. Jules stood. He raised his glass. He looked at Celestine. He began to speak. Jules was talking about legacy. He had the glass raised and the room quiet and every syllable landing exactly where he wanted it to land. He was saying something about building a future worthy of the family he was joining. I was sitting 3 feet away with my hands flat on the tablecloth when I felt the grip on my shoulder. Eugene's hand, tight, urgent, the grip of a man who does not touch people unless the information requires it. I turned. He was crouched behind my chair, half in shadow, his phone held low between us. His face told me everything before he opened his mouth. It came through, he whispered. Step outside, now. I stood. I did not excuse myself. Jules glanced at me mid-sentence, paused for half a beat, then continued. I walked to the back of the tent and threw the canvas flap into the cold air of the parking lot, and Eugene was right behind me. He turned the phone so the screen faced me. The Fulton County seal, digital, embossed, time-stamped 11 minutes ago. Below it, a marriage certificate, the groom's full legal name, the bride's name, the filing date, and at the bottom, in the space reserved for dissolution or annulment, one word, none. The seal was raised digitally, letters I could not touch but could feel in my chest like a second heartbeat. This was not a phone confirmation. This was not hearsay. This was a certified public record issued by the state of Georgia, confirming that the man standing inside that tent with a champagne glass and a speech about legacy was legally married to a woman named Isolde Norris and had been for 4 years and had never filed a single document to end it. "He's already married," Eugene said quietly. "Georgia, never divorced. I have the certified record." I looked at the screen. I read the name twice. I read the date. I read the word none. Then I looked at the tent. Through the canvas, I could hear the MC's voice, bright and amplified. "Please raise your glasses to the happy couple." Applause. The sound of 30 people lifting champagne flutes, the clink of glass. My daughter's name spoken into a microphone by a man who did not know what I knew. I stood in the parking lot with the cold pressing against my face and the phone glowing between us and the sound of celebration leaking through canvas walls. And I understood that I had arrived at the moment I had been preparing for since the night I first called Eugene from my study. The moment where knowing becomes doing, where the evidence stops being abstract and becomes a decision that will change every relationship in your life. What do you do with the truth when telling it will break the person you are trying to save? You tell it anyway, because the alternative is watching her build a life on a lie and knowing you had the document in your hand and said nothing. I looked at Eugene. "Stay here," I said. "Whatever happens next, I need you to have that phone ready." Eugene nodded. He did not ask what I was going to do. He had known me long enough to read the answer in the way I was standing. I turned toward the tent. I could hear Jules' voice through the canvas, still speaking, still smooth, still delivering the toast he had rehearsed. I could hear laughter in the pauses. I could hear Celestine's voice once. A single word I could not make out, followed by more applause. Through the tent canvas, I could hear my daughter laughing. The same laugh from the backyard when she was 12. The same laugh from the kitchen when she told me about the engagement party plans. The same laugh she had given me her whole life, the one that meant she was happy, the one that meant everything was right, and I was about to take it away. I was about to walk into that tent and say words that would end her engagement, humiliate the man she loved in front of everyone she knew, and force her to look at me and decide whether I was her protector or her destroyer. There was no version of the next 5 minutes where my daughter did not cry. There was no version where she thanked me tonight. There was only the version where I told the truth and the version where I did not. And I had spent 30 years in a profession where the second version always ended worse. I straightened my jacket. I squared my shoulders. The gravel crunched once under my right foot as I shifted my weight forward. I pushed through the tent flap. 30 faces turned. The string lights swayed. Jules was standing at the head of the table with his champagne raised, mid-sentence. Celestine glowing beside him with her hand on his arm. The room was warm and golden and full of people who believed they were celebrating something real. I walked toward them. Not fast, not slow. The steady, measured gait of a man who had spent 30 years walking into rooms where people did not want him, delivering news they did not want to hear. To people who had spent a long time believing they had gotten away with it. Jules saw me coming, his glass lowered 1/2 inch, his smile held, but his eyes changed. I did not stop walking. The champagne in Jules's hand caught the string lights and threw a gold line across the tablecloth. He was mid-sentence. Something about the future. Something about what it meant to become part of a family like ours. His voice was warm, his timing was perfect. Every guest was watching him. Then I said his name. Jules. One word. not loud, the volume I used to use in interview rooms when I wanted the subject to lean in. Jules stopped speaking. He looked at me. The tent went quiet the way a room goes quiet when the air pressure changes. "Before we raise our glasses," I said, "I have a question for you, son." I did not raise my voice. I did not step closer. I stood at the edge of the head table with my hands at my sides and 30 faces turning toward me one by one. And I asked the question I had been carrying for 6 weeks. "Which state were you previously married in?" The silence that followed was not empty. It full of 30 people processing a sentence that did not belong at an engagement party, full of the jazz trio lowering their instruments, full of the caterer in the back freezing with a tray half raised. I could taste the champagne I had not drunk, metallic and sharp at the back of my throat. Jules laughed. It was a good laugh, practiced, the laugh of a man who had talked his way out of rooms before. "Come on," he said. "This is a party, not a deposition." He looked at the crowd. He smiled. He waited for them to laugh with him. Nobody did. I did not blink. "It's a simple question," I said. "You were married before. Which state?" Jules' smile held, but the mechanics behind it shifted. I could see it. The recalibration. The same process I had watched in hundreds of interviews when a subject realizes the questioner already knows the answer and is not asking for information, but for confession. Somewhere behind me, a champagne flute hit the grass. The soft thud and the faint splash of wine on soil. Nobody bent to pick it up. Nobody moved at all. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jules said. His voice was still controlled, but the register had dropped, defensive. "This is ridiculous. Celestine, tell your father." "Georgia," I said. The word landed in the tent like a stone dropped into still water. I watched it hit him. I watched the ripple cross his face. "Fulton County," I said. "Would you like to tell Celestine, or should I?" Jules did not speak. For the first time since I had met him. Jules Ross did not have a sentence ready. His mouth opened and closed and opened again, and what came out was not a denial, it was breath. A short, shallow breath that told every person in that tent what they needed to know. Celestine's hand was still on his arm. I could see it from where I stood. Her fingers had gone rigid, the way a person holds something they are about to let go of. Her face had shifted in stages. I could track confusion first, then disbelief, then something harder, something that looked like recognition. Like a piece of information she had been carrying in a locked drawer had just opened itself without her permission. She was looking at Jules. He was looking at me. 30 people were looking at all of us. I kept my eyes on Jules, only on Jules, not on the guests, not on Percy, who I could feel watching from 3 rows back, not on my daughter. Because if I looked at Celestine right now, I would stop, and stopping would mean losing her to a man who was already someone else's husband. "This is insane," Jules said. His voice cracked on the second word. Not much, just enough. "You have no idea what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," I said. "I have been doing it for 30 years. Another silence. Longer this time, the kind of silence that rearranges a room. The guests had become an audience, and the audience had become witnesses. And the witnesses were watching a man whose charm had left him standing in a tent full of string lights with nothing to say. Jules set his champagne glass down on the table, carefully, deliberately. The base touched the cloth, and the sound it made was the loudest thing in the tent. A small sound, a precise sound, the sound of a man buying himself one more second before the next sentence arrives. He turned to Celestine. "Baby," he said, "your father is confused. Let me explain. There was a situation years ago, a legal technicality. It was resolved." "Which state?" Celestine said. Her voice was quiet, steady, the voice of a woman who reads numbers for a living and knows when someone is presenting data that does not add up. Which state? Jules. He did not answer. Celestine turned to me. Her eyes were dry. Her jaw was set. She was not crying. She was not confused. She was looking at me with an expression I recognized because I had seen it in my own mirror every morning for 30 years. She was looking at me the way a person looks when they already know the answer and need someone to confirm it. The tent was silent. The string lights swayed. Jules's glass sat on the tablecloth, catching light it no longer deserved. Celestine pulled her hand off Jules's arm like she had touched something hot. The guests nearest the head table stepped back without knowing why. The way bodies move away from a sound before the brain registers what made it. She turned from me back to Jules. Her eyes were dry. Her voice was low and steady. The voice she used in conference rooms when a client's numbers did not reconcile and she needed the truth before the next sentence. "Answer him," she said. "Right now, which state? Jules." Jules shifted his weight. He reached for her hand. She pulled it away. He let his arm drop and recalibrated. I could see the machinery working behind his face, the same process I had watched in the parking lot, in the steakhouse. In every room where Jules Ross needed to become the version of himself that would survive the next 30 seconds. "Celestine," he said. His voice was soft, intimate, pitched for her ears, not the room's. "This is your father's paranoia. You know how he is. Let's step outside and talk about this privately, just the two of us." "No." The word was flat, final, not angry, not emotional, just closed, the way a door closes when the lock is already turned. "We are not stepping outside," Celestine said. "We are standing right here, in front of every person you invited to celebrate something that might not be real, and you are going to answer a simple question." Someone in the crowd whispered two words I could not make out. "In that tent." A whisper carried like a gunshot. I saw Percy Bailey lean forward in his chair 3 rows back. I saw the caterer set down her tray. I saw 30 people holding their breath. Jules tried again. He turned to the crowd this time, palms open, the gesture of a man appealing to reasonable people. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, "a family matter that got a little heated. I'm sure we can all—" "Mercer and Holt," Celestine said. Jules stopped. "Mercer and Holt doesn't exist," she said. "I checked. You told me a firm called Mercer and Holt handled your templates. I searched every variation. There is no law firm, no attorney's office, no business filing under that name in any state. You lied to me about a letterhead." "Jules. And now my father is asking you about a marriage in Georgia, and you won't answer." She stepped toward him. 1 step. Her heels were silent on the grass. "So tell me, what does exist?" "In Georgia." Jules's charm had always been a locked door. You knocked and he opened it, and behind it was warmth and light and exactly the room you wanted to be in. But Celestine had just kicked that door open, and behind it was nothing. No warmth, no room, just a hallway leading to another locked door, and behind that one, another. And the hallway went on forever, because there was no room at the end. There had never been a room. Jules looked at Celestine. He looked at me. He looked at the crowd. His expression cycled through options the way a cornered animal cycles through escape routes: charm, denial, outrage, reason. Each one surfaced and was discarded in the time it took a string light to sway once in the wind. He settled on outrage. "You're going to stand here and let your father ambush me?" he said to Celestine. "At our party? In front of our friends? This is about control." "This has always been about control. He never wanted you to be happy. He wanted you to be his." I rubbed the words. I watched her face for the fracture, for the moment where his accusation would land and she would doubt me and turn and ask whether I had gone too far. I waited for it the way you wait for a verdict. It did not come. Celestine looked at Jules with the methodical calm she used on spreadsheets that did not balance. And I had never been prouder of her, and more heartbroken at the same time. Proud because she was standing exactly the way I had taught her to stand. Heartbroken because she should never have had to. "If it's a misunderstanding," she said quietly, "then answer the question. One word. Which state?" Jules did not answer. The silence lasted 4 seconds. I counted. 4 seconds in a tent full of people who had come to celebrate an engagement and were now watching it come apart under string lights and December cold. 4 seconds during which the man my daughter loved could have said anything, could have explained, could have named any state or any technicality or any version of the truth that would have bought him 1 more minute. He said nothing. Then he took 1 step backward, then another. His hand dropped from Celestine's reach. He straightened his jacket, a quick pull at the lapels, the same gesture I had made minutes earlier when I walked through the tent flap. He looked at Celestine. He looked at me. He looked at the 30 faces watching him with expressions that had shifted from confusion to understanding. "You people have no idea what you're doing," he said. His voice was different now. The warmth was gone. The charm was gone. What remained was flat, cold, and precise, the voice of a man who had stopped performing. His eyes locked on the parking lot gate behind me. I recognized the look. I had seen it on men I had chased for a living. The look of a man calculating distance. Jules did not run. He turned back toward Celestine, and something behind his eyes shifted from calculation to violence in the time it took me to draw a breath. It was a shift I had seen before, in rooms with bolted doors and two-way mirrors. The moment when a man who has been performing decides the performance is over, and what is left underneath is the thing he has been hiding all along. He stepped toward her. "You did this," he said. His voice was a blade. No charm, no warmth, just the raw, stripped edge of a man whose mask had been ripped off in front of an audience. "You and your father! You ruined everything!" Celestine did not step back. She stood exactly where she was, and I saw the shift in her posture before I understood what it meant, weight dropping into her hips, hands open at her sides, feet shoulder-width apart. I had drilled that stance into her since she was 12 years old, in our backyard, on Saturday mornings. Over and over, until it became muscle memory she did not need to think about. Jules raised his hand. He hit my daughter. The sound of his palm against her cheek was wet, flat, and final. The kind of sound that turns witnesses into testimony. It cut through the tent like a starter pistol. 30 people gasped at the same time. A single collective breath sucked inward, and the tent went silent in a way that silence has no right to be. He hit my daughter. In front of 30 people, under string lights I had hung that morning. He hit my daughter. I surged forward. Every instinct I had trained into my body over 3 decades fired at once, but Celestine was already moving. Before I tell you what my daughter did next, I need to pause. If you are still with me right now, comment your gut reaction in 1 word, just 1, for what you are feeling, because this next part is a point of no return. Please note some notes going forward are dramatized for storytelling purposes. The message underneath is what matters. Jules lunged again. He came at her with his full weight, the way men come at people when they have stopped thinking and started reacting. His right hand reached for her shoulder. His momentum carried him forward. He was taller. He was heavier. He faster. None of it mattered. Celestine pivoted, left hip dropping, right hand catching his wrist, her whole body turning like a door on a hinge. She did not fight his momentum. She redirected it. She let his weight carry him past her, and as he went by, she guided his arm down and to the right, and his own force did the rest. I taught her that move when she was 12. Hip pivot, redirect, let their weight do the work. She had hated it at 14 and forgotten it at 20, and on a Saturday night in December, she executed it cleaner than I ever could. Jules hit the oak table at the edge of the tent. He hit it with his shoulder and the side of his chest, and the crack of his collarbone was audible from the back row of chairs. Champagne flutes shattered. The table shifted 6 inches across the grass, and Jules went down. He did not get up. I had imagined 100 ways this night could end. Confrontation, denial, a quiet conversation in the parking lot where I showed him the documents and he disappeared. I had imagined anger and tears and lawyers. But watching my daughter standing over a broken man in a white dress, breathing through her nose, hands trembling, the red mark on her cheek already swelling into something that would be photographed and filed as evidence, was not one of them. Jules lay on the ground surrounded by shattered glass and oak splinters, looking exactly like what he had always been, wreckage dressed up as a celebration. Celestine stood over him. Her hands were shaking. Her voice was not. "Don't you ever touch me again." The tent was frozen. 30 people standing exactly where they had been standing when the slap landed, not one of them having moved, not one of them speaking. The jazz trio had their instruments at their sides. The caterer was holding a tray she had forgotten she was holding. Percy Bailey was on his feet, his face the color of chalk. I stepped forward. I reached my daughter. She turned and folded into me, not crying, not speaking, just breathing against my chest with the shallow, controlled breaths of a person whose adrenaline has not yet told her body that the danger has passed. I held her. I put my hand on the back of her head. I said nothing because nothing was what she needed. Over her shoulder, I saw 2 things. Eugene stepped through the tent flap with his phone raised. Behind him, through the open canvas, blue and red lights were already strobing in the parking lot. Someone had called before I had the chance. I looked down at Jules. He was conscious. His right arm was folded against his chest at an angle that arms are not supposed to fold. His face was white. His jaw was working, but no words were coming out. I looked at the room. "Someone call 911, I said quietly, and nobody leaves. Celestine was still standing exactly the way I'd taught her, weight-centered, hands open, breathing through the nose, and I realized she hadn't needed me at all. Jules lay crumpled on the flagstone, 3 feet from the overturned cake table, his left arm folded at an angle that made 2 guests turn away. My daughter hadn't moved. She stood over him like a woman waiting for a crosswalk signal, calm and vertical, and I felt something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with fear. Pride. That's the word. Not the cheap kind you get from a bumper sticker or a graduation photo. The kind that burns behind your ribs because you watched someone you raised become someone you'd trust with your life. "That's my daughter," I said. I didn't say it to anyone in particular. I said it to the evening air, to the string lights swaying above the torn tent flap, to the 30-odd guests frozen in a half circle like a Renaissance painting of Judgment Day. Percy Bailey heard me. He'd been standing near the beverage station with a sparkling water in his hand, and now he crossed the flagstone with the deliberate stride of a man who'd seen enough courtrooms to know when the record mattered. "Otis," Percy set the water down on the nearest table. At 67, Percy still carried himself like the estate planning attorney who'd drafted our family trust 20 years ago. Lean, silver-haired, voice like a closing argument. "I'm freezing the trust tonight. Emergency provision, Section 9. Nothing moves until I say it moves." "Do it," I said. Percy already had his phone out. I watched him tap a number from memory, his paralegal. I assumed and stepped 3 paces away, murmuring instructions with the efficiency of a man who billed in 6-minute increments, even on Saturdays. Jules groaned. He tried to push himself upright with his good arm, and the sound that came out of him was half gasp, half theater. "You people," he managed. "You have no idea what you've done." "Stay down," Celestine said. Just 2 words, no volume, no tremor. Jules stayed down. The police lights I'd seen strobing through the parking lot resolved into 2 South Lake PD cruisers that rolled to a stop on the access road beside the venue's east gate. The first officer through the gate was a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, whose nameplate read Dwyer. Officer Dwyer took one look at the torn tent, the overturned table, the man on the ground, and the woman standing over him, and reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 14. I need EMS to the South Lake Garden venue, East Lawn. 1 male, possible fracture, conscious and breathing." He clipped the radio back and turned to me because I was the nearest person standing. "Sir, are you the host?" "Father of the bride," I said. "Former U.S. Deputy Marshal, retired. The man on the ground is Jules Ross. He's a bigamist." Dwyer's expression didn't change, but his hand moved from his radio to his notebook. 22 years of law enforcement taught me to recognize the moment a patrol officer's night shifts from noise complaint to felony. It's a stillness behind the eyes. A recalibration. Dwyer had it. "We're going to need statements," he said, "from everyone involved." Eugene appeared at my elbow. I hadn't seen him cross from the coffee shop parking lot where he'd been stationed, but Eugene had always moved like smoke through a screen door. He held a manila folder in his left hand and his phone in his right, the screen still glowing with whatever he'd been recording. "Officer?" Eugene extended the folder. "Certified marriage record, Fulton County, Georgia. Jules Avery Ross and Isolde Elaine Norris. Marriage solemnized August 14th, 2020. No dissolution filed in any jurisdiction we've checked, and we've checked 6. Dwyer took the folder, opened it, read for 4 seconds, and closed it. "You said bigamy." "That's what I said." "We have an active investigation," Dwyer said, and the way he said it flat, procedural. Unsurprised, told me this wasn't the first time Jules Ross's name had crossed a law enforcement desk. Dwyer turned to his partner. "Secure the scene. Nobody leaves until we have contact information." The paramedics arrived 90 seconds later. 2 men with a stretcher who knelt beside Jules and began stabilizing his arm. Jules let them work. His face had gone the color of candle wax, and the charm that had carried him through steakhouse dinners and trust conversations had finally drained out like bathwater. But his eyes were open, and they were moving, not looking at the paramedics, not looking at Celestine, not looking at the police, looking at me. They loaded him onto the gurney. One paramedic elevated his arm, the other strapped him in. Dwyer walked alongside, notebook open, already asking questions. Jules answered with single syllables. The gurney wheels rattled over the flagstone toward the ambulance. And then Jules turned his head. The movement was slow, deliberate. The kind of gesture a man makes when he wants you to remember it. His lips moved. And across 10 feet of evening air, his voice carried just enough for me and no one else. She wasn't the first Barker I looked into. The tent was empty now, except for overturned chairs and 2 Barkers who didn't know how to look at each other without one of them breaking. The ambulance had pulled away 90 seconds ago, its siren off. Jules wasn't dying, just damaged, and the red and blue lights shrank down South Lake Boulevard until they were just another set of taillights in the December dark. Guests had scattered like church mice after a thunderclap. No goodbyes, no lingering at the bar, just car doors and gravel and the particular silence that follows a scene nobody wants to have witnessed. Percy had left last, squeezing my shoulder once before climbing into his sedan with his phone still pressed to his ear, already dictating the emergency freeze order to his paralegal. I stood in the middle of the flagstone path and listened to his engine fade. Then it was just us. Celestine sat on the venue's front steps with her shoes off, the satin heels tipped sideways on the concrete like 2 small surrendered flags. I lowered myself down beside her. The stone was cold through my slacks, and the night air carried the burnt sugar smell of the catering warmers that nobody had thought to turn off. "How long have you known?" she said. Not angry, not accusing. Just a daughter asking her father the one question that mattered, in a voice so level it could have been asking about the weather. That conversation is for later, baby girl. Right now, I need to know you're okay. She turned and looked at me, and her eyes were wet but her jaw was set. The string lights were still on, swaying in the wind over empty tables like a party that didn't know it was dead yet, and their glow caught the tear tracks on her cheeks, turning them into thin lines of gold. I broke his collarbone. Dad! I know. I'm not okay, she swallowed. But I'm not sorry either. That landed somewhere between my ribs and stayed there. My daughter, the girl who used to cry when she stepped on a cricket barefoot in the backyard, who hand-wrote apology notes to friends she'd mildly inconvenienced, had just put a con man on the ground with a technique I'd taught her in the garage when she was 16, and her only regret was that she wasn't regretting it. There was a harder edge in her than I'd counted on. I didn't know whether to be proud of it or terrified by it, so I settled for both. You don't have to be sorry, I said. He put his hands on you first. I know the law, Dad. Self-defense. She pressed her palms flat on the cold stone. 30 witnesses and a retired deputy marshal. I'm covered. She was right, and the fact that she was thinking that clearly, that tactically, 10 minutes after breaking a man's bone, told me something about my daughter I hadn't fully understood until tonight. She wasn't fragile. She had never been fragile. I'd spent 30 years assuming I was the wall between her and the world, and she'd been building her own foundation the entire time. I put my arm around her. She leaned into my shoulder. And when the tears came, they weren't the polite kind. They were the deep, shaking sobs of a woman whose future had just been detonated in front of everyone she knew. Not fear, not grief pure. Structural grief for a version of her life that had never actually existed. Her tears soaked through my shirt at the shoulder, and I thought, this is what it costs to be right about someone your daughter loved. I didn't speak. I held her and let the December wind carry the sound away across the empty lawn, past the overturned cake table, past the torn tent flap, out into the dark where it couldn't embarrass her. After a while, she pulled back and wiped her face with the heel of her hand. What happens now? Percy freezes the trust first thing Monday. Police have their investigation. Eugene has the documents filed. And Jules goes to a hospital. After that, he goes wherever the law puts him. She nodded. But something crossed her face, a flicker I recognized from my own mirror on nights when a case had gone sideways. Doubt. Not about what she'd done, but about what was still coming. I helped her up. We walked across the parking lot, our shoes crunching on gravel that still held the faint warmth of the afternoon sun, and I opened the passenger door of my truck for her. She climbed in, buckled her seatbelt, and leaned her head against the window. I walked around to the driver's side. That was when it hit me again, Jules's face on the gurney. Not the pain. Not the wax-pale skin, not the awkward angle of the stabilized arm. The eyes. He hadn't blinked once during the entire ride to the ambulance, and that was the detail I couldn't stop seeing. I'd watched fugitives in handcuffs wear that exact expression, not defeat, not fury, just pure arithmetic. Who knows what? What can be proven? What moves remain? A broken collarbone and 30 witnesses hadn't stopped Jules Ross. They'd just changed his timeline. I slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. My phone buzzed against my thigh. I pulled it out. Eugene. One text, just got off with Fulton County DA's office. Jules Ross isn't his real name. Call me. I looked at my daughter. Her eyes were closed, her breath fogging a small circle on the window glass. I put the phone face down on the console and pulled out of the lot. I dropped Celestine at her apartment that night and sat in the driveway with Eugene's text glowing on the console until the screen went dark. Then I drove home, poured 2 fingers of bourbon I didn't drink, and sat in my kitchen until the sun came up. 3 days passed before she called. 3 days of silence that felt like a verdict without a courtroom. Celestine arrived at 9 in the morning with no makeup and a legal pad, and I knew this wasn't a visit, it was a debrief. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, set the legal pad flat, uncapped a pen, and said, "Start from the beginning." No tears, no trembling lip. She had her analyst face on, the one she wore in boardrooms when she was parsing a balance sheet for buried liabilities. I'd seen it once, at a family dinner, when she dismantled a cousin's pyramid scheme pitch in 4 questions. Now she was turning it on me, and I understood that the woman sitting across my kitchen table was not the same woman who had sobbed into my shoulder on the venue steps. She'd had 72 hours to rebuild, and she'd rebuilt in steel. I started with the steakhouse. The first dinner, the questions Jules had asked about the trust, the way he'd steered the conversation toward asset structure with the precision of a man who'd done it before. Celestine wrote the date on her legal pad without looking up. I told her about hiring Eugene, about the LLC flags Percy had found, about the Fulton County search, the marriage record, the name Isolde Norris. I told her about the Mercer and Holt test, the fake law firm she'd fed Jules to see if he'd verify it, and how he'd never corrected the lie because he couldn't afford to reveal what he actually knew about estate law. Celestine wrote, "Eugene hired Oct" on her legal pad, in handwriting so steady it scared me more than tears would have. She underlined it twice and moved to the next line. "The certified record," she said. "When did Eugene get it?" "Day of the party. He'd been waiting on Fulton County for weeks. The stamp came through that morning." "And you decided to confront Jules at the party instead of pulling me aside first." It wasn't a question. It was a fact she was filing. "I made a judgment call," I said. "Eugene had just handed me proof and Jules was standing in front of 30 people about to toast a marriage that was already illegal. I didn't have the luxury of a private conversation. You had the walk from the tent to the microphone. That's about 40 feet. You could have found me in 40 feet. She was right. I'd replayed those 40 feet 100 times in 3 days. And every replay ended the same way, me choosing the public confrontation because it was the move that left Jules no escape route. It was good tactics. Whether it was good fathering was a different calculation entirely. The coffee I'd poured us sat untouched, going cold. I could taste the ghost of this morning's black coffee on the back of my tongue, bitter and insufficient. The kitchen smelled like the cedar cutting board Celestine's mother used to keep by the stove, and for a moment I missed my wife with a sharpness that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with needing someone who would have known the right answer to the question my daughter was about to ask. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" There it was. The question I'd been dreading since the moment I first dialed Eugene's number from the steakhouse parking lot. Every justification I'd rehearsed, protecting the investigation, preserving the element of surprise, shielding her from uncertainty until I had proof sounded in the quiet of my own kitchen, like the arguments of a man who was used to running operations and had forgotten he was running a family. When does protecting your daughter become the same thing as lying to her, and does the answer change if you turned out to be right? "I was afraid telling you early would make you doubt yourself before you needed to be strongest," I said. It was the truest thing I could offer, and I watched it land on her face like a stone hitting still water. She set the pen down. The kitchen table between us felt wider than it had ever been, 2 feet of oak holding the weight of every decision I'd made without her. "I need to think about that," she said. Her voice was level, precise, surgical. "Whether that was protecting me or just protecting your investigation." The word investigation came out of her mouth the way a prosecutor uses it clinically, distanced, stripped of any warmth. She was telling me, without raising her voice, that she saw what I'd done, and she wasn't sure yet whether to call it love or control. Celestine capped her pen. She folded the legal pad closed, stood, and pushed her chair in with both hands. At the door she paused with her fingers on the frame. "One more thing. Eugene said Jules Ross isn't his real name. Did you know that before the party, or after?" I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. 3 decades of interrogation training, and my own daughter had just used silence against me better than any fugitive I'd ever sat across from. She nodded once, a small, tight motion that answered itself, and walked out without closing the door behind her. I stood in my kitchen doorway for a long time after Celestine left, watching the space where her car had been. The door she hadn't closed let in a blade of December air that smelled like dead grass and frozen soil. I closed it myself, slowly, and drove to Eugene's office in Dallas because sitting alone with my daughter's silence felt worse than anything a dossier could show me. Eugene was mid-sentence, walking me through a preliminary background trace on the alias question when his desk phone rang. He glanced at the screen, held up one hand to stop me, and frowned. "Georgia area code," he said. 404, Atlanta. He picked up. "Langley Investigations." The voice that came through the speaker was female, measured, and utterly calm. The kind of calm that doesn't come from composure, but from long rehearsal. "My name is Isolde Norris. I believe you've been looking into my husband." Eugene's eyes met mine across the desk. I'd read that name on a certified county document. I'd said it aloud in my own living room, explained it to my daughter over a legal pad. But hearing it spoken by the woman who owned it was something else entirely, paper turning into a person with a voice that didn't shake. Eugene leaned forward. "Mrs. Norris, we have you on speaker. Otis Barker is here, the father of—" "I know who he is." No hesitation, no surprise. "I've been watching the news." I gripped the arm of Eugene's visitor chair. Isolde Norris was 32 years old, a bookkeeper from Atlanta, and, as of the last document Eugene had pulled, still legally married to the man my daughter had nearly married herself. She was the ghost in the file, the name on line 4 of a county record, the woman whose existence had unraveled everything, and she was calling us. "Mrs. Norris," I said, "how did you get this number?" "Your investigator's name is on the records request he filed with Fulton County. I called the clerk's office and asked who'd been pulling my marriage certificate. They gave me a case reference. I worked backward from there." She paused. "I'm a bookkeeper, Mr. Barker. Working backward is what I do." Eugene scribbled something on a sticky note and slid it across the time. "She's been waiting for this." I nodded. I'd already heard it in her voice, not relief, not panic, but the steady exhale of a woman who'd been holding a breath for 3 years and had just been given permission to let it out. "What can you tell us?" Eugene asked. "More than you want to hear on a phone call." The line went quiet for a beat, and I heard something in the background, a drawer opening, papers shifting. "I have documentation, financial records, correspondence, account transfers, things I kept because I knew this day would come. But I need to bring it in person. What I have shouldn't just be a line in a file." "What kind of woman keeps evidence for 3 years without using it?" I turned the question over, while Eugene asked the practical things. When she could travel, whether she had legal counsel, whether she'd spoken to law enforcement in Georgia. Isolde answered each question with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd anticipated every one of them. She had not filed charges. She had not hired a lawyer. She had, by her own account, simply waited. Patience or fear? I couldn't tell which. Maybe both. Maybe they were the same thing when the man you were afraid of was also the man the system hadn't caught yet. "I can be in Dallas by Thursday," she said. "I'll bring everything." "We'll arrange a meeting," Eugene said. "My office, secure, private, recorded with your consent." "Fine." The conversation should have ended there. I could feel it winding down, the logistics settled, the date set. The professional courtesy of 2 strangers who'd been circling the same man from opposite ends of the country. Eugene reached for the disconnect button. "One more thing," Isolde said. Her voice changed. Not louder, not sharper, just heavier. As if the next sentence had been sitting in her chest for years, and she was finally setting it on a table where someone else could carry the weight. "Your daughter wasn't the second, she was the 4th. I'll bring the names." The line went dead. I realized I'd been gripping the arm of Eugene's chair the same way I'd gripped the napkin at that first steakhouse dinner my body always knew before my mind caught up. I released my fingers one at a time and watched the blood return to my knuckles. 4 families, 4 women, or 4 estates. Because Jules didn't target women, he targeted structures. He targeted trusts and inheritances and the legal architecture that families build around wealth. And he used marriage as the key to walk through the front door. My daughter wasn't a romantic target, she was an access point, and she wasn't even a unique one. Eugene pulled the sticky note back and wrote a single word beneath his earlier message: pattern. "Thursday," I said. "Thursday," he confirmed. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked to the door. Somewhere in Atlanta, a bookkeeper was packing a box that was about to blow the walls off everything I thought I understood about the man who'd tried to marry my daughter. I had 2 days to decide whether to tell Celestine before Isolde arrived or whether my daughter would find out on her own, the way she'd started finding out everything else. I told Celestine. I called her Wednesday night and said a woman named Isolde Norris was flying in from Atlanta with evidence and that she should be in the room when it was opened. Celestine said, "I'll be there," and hung up. No questions, no argument. The door she'd left open at my kitchen table was still open, but she walked through it. The USB drive was small enough to fit in a coin purse, and Isolde set it on Eugene's conference table like it weighed more than everything else in the room combined. She was younger than I'd pictured from her voice on the phone, 32. Slight build, dark hair pulled back tight. Wore a gray blazer over a white blouse that looked like what a bookkeeper wears when she wants to be taken seriously by others. She shook my hand first, then Eugene's, then turned to Celestine and held the handshake an extra beat. No words. Just 2 women looking at each other across the wreckage of the same man. Eugene plugged the drive into his laptop and turned the screen so the 4 of us could see. 4 folders, each one labeled with a surname and a date range. The first was Norris Isolde's own name, followed by 2 I didn't recognize: Pemberton, spanning 14 months in South Carolina, and Gatewood, spanning 9 months in Tennessee. The 4th folder was labeled Barker. 4 folders, 4 women, 4 families, piles. Same font, same margins, same promises filed alphabetically like client accounts. "Start with folder 2, Isolde said. She leaned forward and tapped the trackpad herself. Pemberton, Greenville, South Carolina. Family had a timber trust, not as large as yours, but structured the same way. He proposed within 5 months. The marriage lasted 11 before the wife's brother caught discrepancies in a transfer authorization. Eugene opened the folder. Inside, power of attorney forms, bank transfer authorizations, a drafted trust restructuring proposal. The formatting was identical across every document. Same letterhead template, same paragraph structure, same legal phrasing. Jules hadn't just repeated himself, he'd systematized the fraud the way a franchise owner systematizes a restaurant, right down to the garnish. "Folder 3, Isolde said. "Gatewood, Knoxville. Similar timeline, similar structure. That family had mineral rights." I watched Celestine's face while Eugene clicked through. She wasn't crying, she wasn't clenching her jaw. She was reading, scanning each document with the same analytical precision she'd brought to my kitchen table. Her eyes moving left to right across financial language that she understood better than anyone else in the room. Isolde watched Celestine read with the expression of someone watching a wound they'd already survived, open in someone else, not pity. Exactly. But a kind of grim recognition. "Now open the correspondence subfolder," Isolde said quietly. Eugene opened it. Emails, dozens of them, exported as PDFs, organized by date. Love letters. Or what looked like love letters, the kind of messages a man sends at midnight when he wants a woman to believe she's the only thought in his head. Folder 3, email dated 6 weeks after first contact, Isolde said. Read the second paragraph." Celestine leaned in. Her lips moved slightly as she read, then she stopped. Her hand, resting on the edge of the conference table, went still. Fingers pressed flat against the wood, the way you press a wound to stop it bleeding. "I've never met anyone who makes me want to build something permanent." Celestine read aloud. Her voice was flat, emptied out, stripped of inflection. "He sent me that exact line, word for word." The room went quiet. Eugene closed his eyes for a moment. Isolde nodded. "He sent it to all of us," Isolde said. "Same paragraph, same phrasing, same week in the timeline, 6 weeks in. Every time. It's not a love letter. It's a trigger designed to make you start thinking long-term before you've had time to think critically." Every word Jules had ever said to Celestine was still technically true, the way a script is true every night it's performed for a different audience. The romance wasn't fake because the words were wrong. It was fake because the words were right on purpose, tested and refined across 3 previous targets until they worked like a key in a lock. "He had a process," Celestine said. She pushed back from the table 6 inches. "This was never spontaneous. It's a process." I reached for her hand. She didn't pull away, but she didn't squeeze back either. She was somewhere past comfort in the territory where understanding replaces grief, because grief requires believing something real was lost. And she was no longer sure anything real had existed. Eugene scrolled to the bottom of the 4th folder, ours. Barker. The documents were familiar, the trust restructuring proposals, the financial queries, the drafted amendments. But at the bottom of the directory sat a file I hadn't seen before. Eugene opened it. A drafted amendment to the Barker Family Trust, pre-signed by Jules. The date in the header was 3 weeks before Celestine had ever met him. I leaned forward. The date was unmistakable, typed, formatted, notarized by a service I didn't recognize. Jules hadn't stumbled into my daughter's life at a fundraiser and fallen in love. He'd selected our family by name, studied the trust's structure, and drafted his extraction document before the first dinner. The first smile. The first word. "He knew about us before you knew her," I said. Eugene looked at Isolde. "Who pointed him to the Barkers?" Isolde folded her hands on the table. "That," she said, "is why I brought the 4th folder." Isolde's 4th folder answered the question before Eugene could ask it twice. The predated amendment had been notarized by a mobile service, a one-woman operation that handled document certification for real estate closings across North Texas. Jules hadn't needed an inside man. He'd needed a notary who didn't ask questions, and he'd found one 2 miles from my house. I filed that detail and waited for the rest to fall. It fell 2 days later. Eugene's voice on the phone had a quality I hadn't heard in 30 years of friendship: relief. "Federal wire fraud is on the table," he said. 4 states, 4 families, 1 playbook. The DA called it textbook RICO adjacent. I was standing in my kitchen, the same kitchen where Celestine had sat with her legal pad a week earlier, and I pressed my palm flat against the counter because I needed something solid under my hand. "Walk me through it," I said. Eugene walked. The Tarrant County DA had coordinated with the U.S. Attorney's Office after reviewing the USB evidence. The cross-state trust schemes identical documents filed in South Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, and Texas constituted wire fraud the moment Jules transmitted any of them electronically. The predated trust amendment was the capstone proof of premeditation that turned a pattern of deception into a prosecutable conspiracy. Bigamy charges would run parallel at the state level, but the federal case was the one that carried weight. How many families does one man have to destroy before the law calls it what it is, not a series of mistakes, but a career? "What about the assault charge?" I asked. 30 witnesses and a broken collarbone. Self-defense is clean. Celestine's in the clear. I closed my eyes. That not the one I hadn't acknowledged. The quiet fear that my daughter might face consequences for defending herself against the man who'd tried to rob her family loosened and came apart like old rope. I thanked Eugene, hung up, and stood in my kitchen until the light through the window shifted from afternoon gold to the flat gray of a Texas winter dusk. I didn't call Celestine. I'd learned that lesson. She would come when she was ready, and pushing would only prove she'd been right to question whether my instinct was protection or control. She came that evening. No call ahead. No text, just headlights in the driveway and the sound of her car door closing with the careful precision of someone who'd made a decision on the drive over. I met her at the back door. She walked past me onto the porch without a word, sat down in the wooden chair her mother used to read in, and pulled her jacket tight against the December cold. The backyard smelled like cedar mulch and the faint mineral tang of the sprinkler system I'd winterized 3 weeks ago. The rose bushes were bare for winter cut back to sticks, and I thought that's what this year did to my daughter. Stripped her down to something that would have to grow back from the root. I sat down beside her. The porch light was off, and the only illumination came from the kitchen window behind us, casting our shadows long across the dead grass. "Eugene called you," she said, not a question. "He did. Federal charges." "Yes." She nodded. We sat in the kind of silence that only exists between two people who've been through something together and haven't yet decided what it made them closer or just more careful. "I don't need to like him," Celestine said quietly. "I just need to know who is." My own words, from the backyard conversation that felt like a lifetime ago. She'd carried them with her through everything: the party, the confrontation, the legal pad, the USB drive, the templated love letters, and she was handing them back to me now, not as an accusation, but as an acknowledgement. "I meant every word," I said. "I know." She pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them. "I used to think you didn't trust me to be happy. Now I know you trusted me enough to protect." When Celestine rested her head on my shoulder, I felt the last 6 weeks leave my body like a breath I'd been holding since that first steakhouse dinner. Not relief exactly. Relief implies the danger is over, and I wasn't naive enough to believe that. But something adjacent to relief. Something like the moment a surgeon steps out of the operating room and nods once she's going to be fine. We stayed like that for a while. The neighborhood was quiet lawn sprinklers on timers, a dog barking 2 streets over, the distant hum of Interstate 30. My daughter's breathing slowed against my shoulder, and I thought she might have fallen asleep until she spoke again. "Dad." "Yeah." I looked up the name on that predated document, the notary who certified it. I turned my head. Her eyes were open, fixed on the dark yard, and there was something in them I recognized, not grief, not anger, but the focused stillness of a person who has stopped being a victim and started being an investigator. "She works for a firm in Fort Worth," Celestine said, 2 miles from here. I looked at my daughter, the woman who'd sobbed into my shoulder at the venue, who'd walked out of my kitchen without closing the door, who'd read her own love letters exposed as templates. That woman was still in there. But sitting beside me now was someone new. Someone who wasn't just healing. She was hunting. We passed the notary lead to Eugene, who passed it to the federal investigators building the wire fraud case. Celestine wanted to knock on the woman's door herself, but I told her the best hunting is the kind that lets the law carry the rifle. She didn't argue. She was saving her ammunition for a different room. The courtroom smelled like old wood and floor polish, and Celestine walked to the witness stand the way she walked into boardrooms, straight-backed, prepared, and unwilling to repeat herself. It was the first week of January, and the Tarrant County Courthouse was still running on holiday staffing, but Judge Calloway's courtroom was full. Harold Calloway was a silver-templed veteran of the Tarrant County bench, somewhere past 60. Who read the charges without inflection and watched the defendant without blinking. He'd presided over fraud cases for 2 decades and the look he gave Jules when the bailiff brought him in was the look of a man who'd seen this species before. Jules sat at the defense table in a county-issued jumpsuit, his left arm still in a sling. He'd been assigned a public defender, a young woman with a thick case file and the particular tension of someone who knows her client's guilt but is bound by oath to argue otherwise. Jules didn't look at her. He looked at the gallery. He looked at me. I held his gaze from the third row. Eugene sat to my left, Isolde to my right. Percy had a seat behind us, close enough that I could hear him breathing. Celestine was sworn in at 9:14. The prosecutor, a Tarrant County assistant DA whose name I'd already forgotten because the case had moved past individuals and into institutions, asked her to describe the events leading to the confrontation. Celestine did. She described the engagement, the trust conversations, the document anomaly she'd spotted, the confrontation at the party. She described the slap. She described breaking Jules's collarbone in response. I sat in the gallery and watched my daughter testify about the worst night of her life with the composure of a woman who'd decided shame belonged to someone else. She didn't cry. She didn't pause for effect. She presented facts in sequence, the way she'd present a quarterly earnings analysis, clear, sourced, and impossible to dismiss. He sent me the same letter he sent 3 other women, Celestine said, her voice carrying to the back of the room without effort. Word for word, I have the timestamps. The defense attorney objected. Judge Calloway overruled without looking up from his notes. Celestine stepped down. Isolde stepped up. If Celestine had testified like an analyst, Isolde testified like an archivist. She brought her laptop to the stand approved by the court in advance and connected it to the courtroom monitor. The USB folder names appeared on the screen, and the gallery went quiet. 4 surnames, alphabetized, each one a family that had been targeted, infiltrated, and financially mapped by the same man sitting 12 feet away in a sling. I kept everything for 3 years because I knew he'd do it again, Isolde said. Her voice was steady, the same practiced calm from the phone call, now amplified by a courtroom microphone. I just didn't know her name yet. She walked Judge Calloway through the playbook, the identical documents, the templated correspondence, the escalating financial extraction. She showed the predated amendment. She showed the notarization. She showed the timeline that proved Jules had begun targeting the Barker Trust weeks before he'd ever spoken to Celestine. Jules's jaw worked, not speaking, calculating. I watched the muscles in his face shift the way I'd watched fugitives process new information in interview rooms, rapid, silent, strategic. He wasn't listening to Isolde's testimony to defend himself. He was listening to find out exactly how much they had. Judge Calloway removed his reading glasses, set them on the bench, and folded his hands. The court finds sufficient grounds for prosecution on the bigamy and assault counts, he said. The federal wire fraud charges will proceed separately under the U.S. Attorney's Office. The defendant is remanded to custody. Light risk is substantiated by the multi-state nature of the alleged offenses and the defendant's documented use of aliases. The bailiff approached the defense table. Jules stood without being told, a small act of control, the kind of gesture a man makes when everything else has been taken from him. The bailiff cuffed him in front of a room full of people who'd come expecting a hearing and stayed because they'd witnessed an autopsy of a man's entire career. Jules was led toward the side exit. He walked with his chin up and his shoulders square despite the sling, and I almost admired the discipline if I didn't know what it was made of. As he passed our row, he slowed. The bailiff's hand stayed on his elbow, but Jules turned his head not quickly, not desperately, but with the same deliberate motion I'd seen on the gurney. He looked at me. Then his eyes moved to Celestine, then to Isolde, then back to me. His lips moved. 2 words. No sound, or, if there was sound, the courtroom swallowed it. The bailiff pulled him forward. The side door closed behind them with a mechanical click that echoed off the old wood paneling. Eugene leaned forward from the row behind me. His mouth was close enough to my ear that no one else could hear. He said, "Not over." I looked at the closed door. Then I looked at my daughter, who was watching the same door with her legal pad still open on her lap and a pen in her hand. She hadn't written a single word during the entire hearing. She hadn't needed to. She'd memorized everything. Jules mouthed those 2 words, and the bailiff pulled him through the side door, and that was supposed to be the end of it. But "not over" is the kind of thing that sticks to the inside of your skull like tar. And I was still scraping at it in the courthouse hallway when Percy touched my elbow and steered me toward a window alcove away from the crowd. Percy was smiling. Percy Bailey never smiled in courthouses. In 30 years of watching him navigate probate hearings and trust disputes, I'd seen him satisfied, relieved, even quietly triumphant, but never smiling. The expression looked foreign on his face, like a tie he'd borrowed from someone younger. "I need to tell you something that's going to make you laugh," he said, "and you haven't laughed in a while, so I'm going to enjoy this." "I'm listening." "You remember the spousal exclusion clause I built in when we established the trust?" I remembered. Vaguely. It had been one of dozens of provisions Percy had walked me through when we'd set up the family trust over 2 decades ago, legal language I'd signed without fully absorbing because I trusted Percy the way you trust the engineer who builds the bridge you drive across every morning. "Any marriage-based asset claim is automatically void," Percy said. "Spousal interest, community property conversion, marital right of election, all of it. Blocked at the structural level. Jules could have married Celestine and filed every document on that USB drive and gotten nothing, not a dime." I stared at him. The hallway noise, footsteps, a clerk's cart rattling, a lawyer on a phone call faded to static. "He never had a chance," I said. "Not from day one." Percy leaned against the windowsill. "Your wife insisted on that clause, by the way. Said she'd seen too many families torn apart by the wrong-in-law. I told her it was unusual for a trust of that size. She told me unusual was exactly the point." My wife. Gone 7 years, and still protecting this family from a man she'd never meet, from a future she'd never see. The clause was still there, doing its job, like she'd never left. I pressed my back against the cool stone of the hallway wall and felt something release in my chest, not a laugh, not exactly, but something close. A sound that started in my throat and came out as a single exhale that might have been the first genuine moment of lightness I'd felt since October. "She was smarter than both of us," I said. "She was smarter than most people I've billed," Percy said. "And I've billed a lot of people." I thanked him. He squeezed my shoulder the same way he had in the venue parking lot, one firm press. No words needed, and walked back toward the courtroom to file his post-hearing motions. I stood in the alcove for another minute, thinking about a woman who'd sat at a lawyer's conference table 20 years ago and decided that the best way to protect her family's future was to assume the worst about the people who might try to enter it. 3 days later, Celestine called and told me she was meeting Isolde for coffee. She didn't ask me to come. She didn't need to explain why. 2 women who'd survived the same predator had earned the right to sit across from each other without a father or an investigator moderating the conversation. I know what happened because Celestine told me afterward. Sitting in my truck in the Camp Bowie parking lot with 2 empty paper cups between us. The coffee shop was the kind of quiet place where 2 strangers could sit down as victims and stand up as something closer to friends, brick walls, mismatched chairs. A barista who didn't rush you. Celestine said they'd talked for 2 hours. Isolde had ordered black coffee and held the cup with both hands the entire time, like she was warming herself against something colder than January. She kept that drive in a fireproof box for 3 years, Celestine told me. Some mornings she'd open the box just to make sure it was still real, that it hadn't disappeared, that she hadn't imagined the whole thing. How many women had Isolde called before my daughter? How many had listened politely, thanked her for the information, and hung up, because believing a stranger on the phone meant admitting their own love story was a lie. "I told her she saved our family," Celestine said. She started crying. First time I've seen cry. "What did she say?" "She said thank you for believing me from the start. She said the other families didn't." "The other families? The ones filed alphabetically on that USB drive. Pemberton, Gatewood, families who'd received the same evidence, heard the same calm voice on the phone, and chosen not to listen because the alternative was too expensive. Too embarrassing, too real." Celestine paused. She turned her empty coffee cup in her hands, rotating it slowly. "There's one more thing," she said. "Something Isolde told me in the parking lot, after we'd paid. Something she didn't put on the USB." I waited. "He has a son, Dad. A little boy, 6 years old. He lives with Jules's mother in Savannah. He doesn't know any of this." Celestine looked at me, and for the first time since the party, her eyes held something that wasn't anger or analysis or grief. It was compassion complicated, unwanted, impossible to set down. The case had just become about more than money or justice. There was a child. A boy in Savannah, 6 years old. A child who drew pictures and lost teeth and called someone mom who wasn't his mother, and had no idea his father was sitting in a Tarrant County holding cell waiting for a federal indictment. I thought about that boy for a week. I thought about what it means to punish a man when the punishment lands on someone who never chose him. The rose bushes had survived the winter just barely, and I noticed the first tight buds forming on the lowest branches when I walked into the backyard that Saturday morning. Late January in Fort Worth is the ugliest part of the year. Brown lawns, gray skies, a wind that cuts through your jacket like it's looking for something personal. But those buds were there, small and stubborn, pushed through withdrawal that looked dead from every angle. I sat down in the wooden chair and let the morning settle around me. The yard smelled like wet mulch and the faint chemical sweetness of the neighbor's dryer vent. A mockingbird was working through its repertoire on the back fence, cycling through stolen songs with the confidence of a performer who'd never been caught plagiarizing. Celestine's car pulled into the driveway at 10. No call ahead, no text. Just the sound of her door closing and her footsteps through the house, the back door opening, her jacket draped over the porch rail. Her body dropping into the chair beside mine with the easy weight of someone who'd stopped asking permission to arrive. She used to do this before all of it. Before the steakhouse, before Jules, before the legal pads and the courthouse and the USB drive. She'd show up on Saturday mornings with coffee and sit in this chair, and we'd talk about nothing her week play, my yard, whether the Cowboys had any chance this season. The ordinary machinery of a father and daughter who liked each other's company. She hadn't brought coffee today. She'd brought something else. "I've been thinking about what you said," she started, "back in the fall, in this yard." I remembered. The confrontation. The moment I'd told her I didn't trust Jules and she'd looked at me like I'd betrayed her. They were the same chairs, the same yard. But the season had changed, and so had the distance between us, which was now measured in trust instead of secrets. "You didn't investigate because you didn't trust me," Celestine said. She was looking at the rose bushes, not at me. "You investigated because you believed I deserved to be protected. I couldn't see the difference before." I opened my mouth to respond and found that nothing adequate existed in the English language. 30 years of marshalling witnesses, building cases, interrogating suspects, and my daughter had just summarized the last 4 months of my life in 2 sentences I couldn't have written myself. "I only wish I hadn't needed to be right," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. My eyes were doing something I couldn't entirely control, not crying, not quite, but the specific reddening that comes from the exhaustion of carrying something heavy for months and finally being told you can set it down. Celestine reached over and took my hand. Her fingers were cold from the January air, and I wrapped both of mine around them, the way I used to when she was small and we'd walk through parking lots in winter. "You taught me how to fight," she said. "Mom taught the trust how to protect itself. Between the two of you, Jules never had a chance." The mockingbird stopped singing. The yard went quiet, just wind and the distant hum of a Saturday morning in Fort Worth. Lawnmowers and church bells and someone's radio playing country music 2 houses down. "But I'm glad you were right," Celestine said. I squeezed her hand. We sat there for a while without speaking. The buds on the rose bushes caught the weak January light, and I thought about my wife, about the woman who'd sat in a lawyer's office 2 decades ago and insisted on a clause that sounded paranoid at the time and turned out to be prophecy. She protected this family from her grave, and she'd done it with a single paragraph of legal language that Jules Ross, for all his research, had never thought to look for. Celestine let go of my hand and leaned back in her chair. She pulled her phone from her jacket and turned it over once, then set it face up on her knee. "I've been in contact with someone in Savannah," she said. "Jules' mother. Her name is Dorothy. The boy's name is Caleb." I looked at her. "He's 6. Dad. He didn't choose his father. And when this goes federal, when the trial makes the news, someone should have already told him that what his father did doesn't define what he becomes." "Celestine. I'm going next week. Isolde offered to come with me. We're not going as victims. We're going as the people who can look that woman in the eye and say her grandson is not responsible for any of this." She stood. She paused at the back door, the same spot her mother used to stand, watching me water the roses through the kitchen window, and turned back. "You raised me to protect people. Dad. You didn't say it had to stop at our family." She walked through the house. I heard the front door close gently. "This time, the way you close a door you intend to come back through." I sat alone in the yard and watched the buds on the rose bushes and thought she's going to be better than both of us. Celestine went to Savannah. She and Isolde flew out on a Tuesday and came back on a Thursday, and when I asked how it went, Celestine said, "He's a good kid, Dad. He draws horses." She didn't say anything else about it for weeks, and I didn't press. Some things need time to settle before they become stories. 5 months later, the kitchen smelled like someone else's cooking for the first time since my wife died, and I didn't mind. It was a Saturday in May. The windows were open because Fort Worth had finally remembered what spring felt like, and a warm breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and the jasmine the neighbor had planted along the fence line. Celestine had arrived first, around noon. With a bag of groceries and a stack of law school brochures she spread across the kitchen table like a hand of cards. "Financial law," she said, tapping the top brochure. "Forensic accounting and regulatory compliance. Someone should know how to spot what Jules did before it gets that far." "You'd be good at it," I said, and I meant it the way you mean something that's been true for longer than you realized. Isolde knocked at 1:15. She'd started making the trip from Atlanta once a month, a habit that began as check-ins about the federal case and had quietly become something else. She carried a covered dish in both hands and set it on the counter with the careful placement of a woman who understood that food in someone else's kitchen is an act of trust. "I brought the cobbler again," she said. "Your father said last time it reminded him of someone's recipe." She meant my wife's. And it did the brown sugar crust, the slight tartness of the peaches, the way it filled the kitchen with a sweetness that felt inherited rather than invented. I was grateful she didn't say it out loud. Some comparisons are better left as warmth than words. We ate at the kitchen table, the 3 of us. Celestine talked about her application essays. Isolde talked about the boy in Savannah, his school play, his new teacher, the horse drawings that had graduated from crayon to colored pencil. I listened and passed the cobbler and refilled coffee cups and did the thing I'd spent 61 years learning was the hardest part of fatherhood, I sat still and let the people I cared about be happy without trying to manage it. Celestine laughed at something Isolde said about the boy trying to teach his grandmother to use a tablet. And it was the first laugh I'd heard from my daughter in 5 months that didn't have something underneath it. No edge, no bravery, no performance. Just a laugh, clean and sudden, the kind that catches you off guard because your body remembers joy before your mind gives it permission. Nobody mentioned Jules. Nobody needed to. He was awaiting federal trial in a facility I'd never visit, represented by attorneys I'd never meet, facing a sentence that would be decided by people who'd never sat at this table. The system had him. My job was done. They left around 4. Celestine hugged me at the door. A real hug. The kind where you hold on for an extra second because you're not saying goodbye, you're saying thank you. Isolde shook my hand and then for the first time hugged me too. Quick, formal, but real. I watched them walk to their cars and pull out of the driveway. Celestine's hand raised in a wave through the window. I went back inside and stood at the kitchen sink. 3 coffee cups. One mine one. Celestine's the blue mug she'd claimed as hers when she was 14 and never relinquished, and one from the cabinet. The plain white one I'd started keeping on the second shelf for Isolde's visits. I turned on the tap. The water was warm. I washed each cup slowly, the way you handle things that matter more than their material justifies. The rose bushes outside the window had come back. Not the same as before, never exactly the same, but green, stubborn, reaching for the fence line like they had somewhere to be. The evening light caught the new growth and turned it golden, and I thought about my wife standing at this same window, watching me water those bushes on summer evenings while Celestine did homework at the table behind her. I built that trust, not because I knew a man like Jules was coming. I built it because I knew I couldn't always be standing at the door. A father's job isn't to stop every bad thing. It's to make sure his daughter can survive the ones he can't stop and recognize the ones she can. If you're a father listening to this, here's what I'll tell you. Prepare for everything. Pray for nothing. And when your daughter turns out stronger than you planned, get out of her way. I set the last cup on the rack and dried my hands on the kitchen towel. My phone buzzed on the counter, a text from Celestine. Sent 5 minutes after she'd left. The boy in Savannah asked about you. He wants to know if Marshals are real. I told him I'd ask mine. I read it twice. I set the phone down on the counter, next to the dish where Isolde's cobbler had been. 3 cups drying in the last of the light. That's what winning looks like. Not a courtroom, not a broken collarbone. Just an ordinary kitchen, an open window, and the quiet proof that the people you love came through it whole. I spent months carrying a secret that could have torn my family apart. I told myself I was protecting my daughter, but the truth is, I was also protecting my pride, the need to be right, the need to control the outcome. If I could do it over, I'd have trusted her sooner. Don't make my mistake. The people you love deserve the truth, even when the truth ugly. This family drama taught me something I wish I'd learned earlier. Protecting someone doesn't mean keeping them in the dark. Real protection is giving the people you love enough information to protect themselves. That's the lesson at the heart of this life story, and it's one I carry every single day. I believe God put me through this so I could stand here and tell you, trust the people you raised. Trust what you built into them. The revenge stories people want to hear aren't always about getting even. Sometimes a dad's true revenge is raising a daughter who can handle the storm without him. That's the real storytelling, not the confrontation, not the courtroom. It's the quiet moment after, when you realize the person you protected didn't need saving. She needed you to believe in her. If this story touched something in you, leave a comment and tell me what would you have done differently. Would you have told your daughter sooner? Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. A parent? A friend? Anyone who's carrying a secret to protect someone they love. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you never miss another story like this one. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. As always, some details in this story were fictionalized for storytelling and reflection. The people and events are not meant to represent real individuals. What matters is the message, and I hope this one stays with you.